But the advantage that we have of being out there for an operator or a third party or a partner is that we can create kind of like, I call them the state of the pad at any given time. So we can infer from all the raw data that we get what's going on the pad. So, for those that have seen our application, we talk about our critical path and everything that's happening there. So we create the critical path from the raw data, which contextualizes what's going on in every second and every day on a job. And so when you look at it from the other side, when you want to actually go look at data, you actually do the opposite, right? So what we do is like we get all the raw data and then we create a contextualization layer on top of it that helps you kind of map your way through that data set. And then when you are going to look through that data after the fact or during or whatever, you actually come from the top, look at the context and say, what am I looking at, right? What am I looking for? I'm looking for, the treating pressure or the wellbore pressure on well X at this time during stage X, during the pad or the slurry or the start of the slurry. And then I can kind of ask that question, if you will, through any of the mechanics, right, that we have for data transfer to that contextualization layer. And that will map me to like that raw data feed essentially, or like the original sensor data that are actually going to give me the answers that I want.
That's right, because just looking at raw data, you don't really have the cues for the questions to ask against the data. You need a bit of context to identify what you're looking at.
Yeah, because like what you're looking at is plain comma separated data, right? Time stamped. That's what you're getting, right? If the valves were open on a certain well during that time, like what well were you actually fracking? Like if you look at a frac data set, you'll get a bunch of pressure. If you don't know at what point were you putting pressure on certain well bores, it's close to impossible to determine like what sort of treatment you were putting on each individual well.
That's right.
And that's obviously something that everyone needs to do when you're trying to make sense and leverage the data on a completion site.
Just going back now, you mentioned a term, critical path. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah. So the critical path is our internal name for like, essentially what we have in the application is a Gantt chart and each line of the Gantt chart is a well. And we're trying to capture the activities that are happening on each well at any given second of the day, right? So think about your critical path, typically really centered around frac. So what is getting in the way of your fracking, right? So on the critical path, you'll have standby times, right? You'll have your wirelining, your well switches, and your fracking, right?
Now, the interesting thing about critical path, that name actually came from 8-ish years ago. I was in a boardroom with our CEO at the time, and there was a gentleman with some very bright green glasses, and he kept asking, what's the longest tent pole? How do I see the longest tent pole? So we started asking him questions about this, and he said, I just want to know the critical path. What thing has to happen for us to get to the next stage of the operation? So that's where the name came from.
Yeah, and that's what a critical path typically is in any other context, right? It's like you're typically, it takes you from point A to point B, and what are the necessary steps for me to get from one to the other? Right?
Fantastic. So that's the layer of that's part of the layer of contextualization against the data set.
Yes. So there's all sorts of different type of events that are happening on a frac site that are part of our state of the pad that don't necessarily are not represented on the critical path, but sort of exist in the background. I'll give you an example of that. So if you look at our critical path, like I said, you'll see waterline pump down and frac mostly like one after the other. But then you can think about like places that are resource constraint. If you don't have enough water in your water storage tanks, you're not going to start that frac job, right? So there's some context that also comes from things that are not typically on the critical path like that are part of our event-driven solution that will say, you can say, well, I need my water level to be above a certain threshold to start a frac, right? Or a stage.
Nerds, data in hand. We rock the bytes and we'll take a stand. Calculators flashing like a disco ball. Cold board tech, hey, we answer the call.